Shalom. Hag Sameach, everybody. Welcome to the 2016 Pesach special here on Scroll to Scroll. I look forward to this every year. And I hope that you'll enjoy this as much as I've enjoyed putting it together. And I've been really looking forward to getting back into feast mode. It's been a long winter. And now here we are, ready to serve Him, Father Yah, in His appointed times, and this is just about as big as it gets. Pesach. Well, just so you know, we're going to be having the Pesach special because it is a free open teaching, but it's also, part of the normal Torah portion process as well. We're going to be having this with the Torah portion, with the double portion, Vayikra Sav. We're also going to have it under special Moedim teachings. Okay? Now, Pesach has always been the most personal of all the feasts for me. I was bar mitzvah at Pesach. And Pesach was something that my family, and we were Reformed, so, which means, fairly liberal growing up. And but Pesach was something nobody skimped on in my family. I also had Orthodox strains in my family too, but that was like my grandparents' generation. That's a whole other story. Suffice to say, I went more towards grandpa than my parents there. But in any case, I was bar mitzvahed April 9th, 1977, and in that year, it was the Shabbat Kol HaMoed, the Shabbat in the middle of Pesach. And as a result, I had the longest Haftorah of the year, which is 2 Samuel 2, 1 through 51, which we will be getting to in this special as well. Now, in this particular teaching, you're going to find a number of features here. One is the highlights from a conference that I did last year, which I'm still kind of beaming over the way this conference went, called Exodus Revealed. That was a real scholarly highlight for me, the Exodus Revealed material, and I've been working on it and tweaking it since last year, because I'm never really finished. I'm never really satisfied. And so, more information on Mount Sinai, some of these other interesting topics that we got into. And yes, there is a bit more of the Pesach Q&A. I know we've been doing a lot of that over the last few weeks, but this, Q&A for Pesach has always been part and parcel, to the approach that I have here. And I get more questions about Pesach than all the other feasts combined. And there was some really good stuff that came out, say 6 months ago, and even at last year's Pesach special, which I feel will be helpful going over. I've also got a PowerPoint, which you've seen before, but I like to include it. I've made some minor tweaks to it. It's called When Did Yeshua Die? That's like 186 slides. It's pretty robust. At least I think that it's 186 slides, but it's big. And that gets into a lot of these details as well. And as always, I appreciate all your feedback, and I appreciate that at One Faith, One People Ministries, we not only dialogue, we know how to agree to disagree, we know how to, exchange views that we passionately hold and remain brothers and sisters. And that's what I love about this ministry that Father Yah has graciously allowed me to do. And that's what I love about this community here. It's not just about you hearing me. I hear you too. Okay? And I hope that you guys are getting ready, whether you're doing Pesach as I am next week, March 23rd, evening of March 23rd, or you're doing Pesach rabbinically, which is going to be on April 22nd. I want to get you all ready, whether you're going to be ready for next week or next month. So let's get started because we do have a lot to get to. Getting into some of the finer points because, like I said, there's a lot of little details that surround Pesach, its implementation, its timing, and its connection to the Gospels. One question that I got a lot of in the last few months was, about the Greek reading. And I recognize that not everybody agrees with me about Aramaic. I know a lot of people now honor Aramaic, or say, it's another good ancient source. Some people think the Greek is a primary source. I want you to know that regardless of that, I will totally, from a scholarly perspective, support people asking me about the Greek New Testament, which is still going to be what 90% of you are going to have translations that are, if not influenced from, completely derived from Greek texts. You need to know how your texts actually read. And I made myself, I don't want to say made myself, but what I mean is I took a lot of time learning Greek, as well as Aramaic, as well as Hebrew. So I value it as well. I just have a different opinion about what comes first, and that kind of depends on the location and the history and a whole bunch of other things. Eastern languages go east, Western languages go west. So this question was about the Greek New Testament. Question: does the fact that the Greek New Testament seems to be referencing lechem, now it's not, that's the Hebrew word, which is to say, it seems to be referencing Hebrew bread, as opposed to matzah. Okay, they were expecting the Greek word for matzah, and instead they found the Greek word for lechem, bread. Does that point to the Last Supper being Pesach, being before Pesach, rather? Now, as we talked about, I believe that one scene that is usually tacked on to the Last Supper is actually the 13th going into the 14th, not the 14th going into the 15th. Well, I'm not talking about that. But again, the fact that the Last Supper, the Greek word that is there is the regular word for bread, does that prove that the Last Supper is not Pesach? Or does it prove that Pesach itself began immediately after the sunset on the 13th? And also, does the Aramaic reading on in the Gospels read differently? Does it clarify things? Does it muddy things up? So that's a pretty robust question, and I just wanted to get into this. My answer is that this is the Greek text. This is not the Greek text's fault. This is actually a translation problem. It's not a Greek problem. The Septuagint, which is the official Greek version of the Tanakh, in Exodus 12:18, actually translates matzah into azimos, which is unleavened. See Luke 22, verse 1. And that can refer to bread or cakes without yeast. It is established that the general bread, which is artos in Luke 22:19, and this is the important point. If you look in Luke 22:19, you'll see artos, which means regular bread. But here's the thing. Where it is established that artos is unleavened, okay? And the feast is actually named after it, azimos. So here's my point. And I know I'm throwing around a lot of fancy terms here, but what I'm going to try and just distill what I just sort of said from 6 different directions. Here's the point. If it is established that you're talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, if it says that directly in the text, then it doesn't have to be the case that the bread must be called matzah. It is assumed to be matzah because that's the only bread that you have at the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay? So the feast Pascha is referenced in Luke 22, verse 1, which means whether it's the regular word for bread or the word for matzah, either way, both terms are referring to the Feast of Unleavened Bread because that's the only kind of bread that you eat at Pesach or Pascha. There is no need in biblical Greek to keep calling the bread matzah, so the people that insist that the artos reference in 22:19 is regular lechem, they simply aren't reading through the Greek properly. Okay? The thing is, there's 2 levels to translation. Okay? There's the regular process. This word X means word A in the other language. Okay. But you also have to take into account the cultural aspects. In the 19th century, for example, many scholars believe that there was a unique Hebrew-Greek dialect, that the Hebrew in Israel so powerfully influenced the way Greek was spoken that they had their own dialect. Now, the scholars don't believe this anymore, but they did believe it fervently because there were tons and tons of evidence that showed Hebraic dominance over the Greek that they had from Israel. For example, instead of saying fear not, it'd be not fear. Okay? And there's something called a casus pendens, which is like the subject-verb arrangement, and the Semitic arrangement is opposite the Western or Greek, Latin, English one. And when you see a Western language with the Eastern subject-verb arrangement, right, it points to Semitic influence. And that's what we're seeing. Now, the other thing is, once the kind of bread is established beyond all doubt, the context of Luke 22, as well as similar references that are in the other Gospels, people think that 22:19 can only be regular bread. We'll now have to show how the matzah was swapped out at Passover for regular bread. So if you're going, in other words, if you're going to take a stand and say, I'm applying my principles consistently, and if it doesn't say matzah, I'm going to assume it's leavened. Then when you come up against clear places where they're at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you're going to say that they're eating Wonder Bread? No. Okay? Help build strong bodies. Anyway, good luck. Next question. Moving on. Did the Pharisees have the wrong timing for Pesach, and or is the Gospel of John running a day behind? Now, I am convinced this issue will come up for me every year until Father Yah decides to take me. Okay? Because no matter how often I get into this and how much I try to explain and write about this and show graphs and show references, there's always going to be someone out there that's going to have some doubt about it. Now, that's not meant as a criticism. In fact, I appreciate people being Bereans, and I've said this many, many times. This is something that is going to really impact a lot of people because their translations that they're using sometimes are misleading. Okay? And if they're not directly misleading, then the problem is they don't have enough historical context in their appendix or whatever to walk the reader through this. And as long as that's the case, people will not be well served by a non-scholarly translation. Regardless as to how accurate it is, if it's not documenting it, it's going to create confusion. John is not running a day behind. This is a short answer, and there's more information in the in the PowerPoint that I'm attaching as my annual Pesach gift. But I did want to comment on this in broad terms. Okay? See, the thing is, the Gospel of John, as I said, not running the day behind, but the Pharisees were running on a different schedule because they were following the oral law over the written law. Okay? And we talked about this in various different contexts the previous week. John 18, verse 28, which proves that the Pharisees had violated Torah. Okay? It says that the Pharisees did not want to get defiled by seeing Pilate because they had not yet eaten their Passover lamb. Whereas it was the 14th, the previous evening. We know that because the only time that you could slaughter and prepare the lamb in first century Israel was on the 14th. And we know that in 3 places, in Matthew 26, in Mark 14, and in Luke 22, it says, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came and said, where do you want us to prepare the Pascha? The lamb had already been slit. had already been killed. They are asking, where do you want us to go to get the herbs and the spices and the things and start roasting this thing? Okay? That can only be going from the 14th to the 15th. And yet, the Pharisees still had not eaten their lamb that they were supposed to eat last night and destroy the remainder on the altar at daybreak. And they didn't do either of those things. So why didn't the Pharisees, at least these Pharisees, not eat their lamb on time? Josephus tells us, and we quoted this a couple times, this Jewish War, book 6, that on a typical Passover in the first century, they would slaughter 256,000 plus lambs. And they would do that, by the way, in 2 hours. 2 hours. Between the 9th and the 11th hour. Now, why the 9th and the 11th hour? Because the last hour, the 12th hour, was the last shot they had. That was when they would try to do it for their families, or for themselves, or for their group. So busy helping everyone else first that they only got an hour to get it done for themselves. And if they don't, then it creates a problem. So what they decided to do in that case was, if they had not slaughtered their 14th Abib lamb, instead of having to, they couldn't destroy it at daybreak because they hadn't slaughtered it. So they gave the Pharisees until, by oral law, in this situation, they gave them an extra 12 hours to get it done by sunset. Okay? Pesachim 6:4, which is the Talmud law on this matter, reads as follows, according to Jacob Neusner of Yale University, one of the greatest Jewish scholars in the world. And he says, a festal offering derives from the flock or the sheep, or from the herd of oxen, from lamb or from goats, from males or from females, and is eaten for 2 days to the intervening night of the 15th of Nisan. So that's the rule that was in place in the first century, and the Pharisees applied that to themselves. But you see, if they had been defiled by seeing Pilate, they would not have been able to do that. And on this particular point, I want to talk about one of my heroes. I do have heroes, you know. It's not just me teaching, giving opinions and stuff. There, you know, as I always try to say at some point during the year, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And we stand in the shadow of heroes. Not that they're perfect people, but great men and women of the past who really helped, you know, bring these truths to light. And one of these people is one of my favorite is a guy named Alfred Edersheim. Edersheim is just like a lot of us Jewish people who are in the Hebrew Roots movement. You know, he was raised Orthodox. I believe he was a rabbi at one point. He went to the academies. He learned all the traditions, and then he became a Christian. Now, I guess there wasn't really a Hebrew roots option for him where he could keep being Torah observant and believe in Yeshua, but he became a Christian. But when he got into the church, something funny happened. Edersheim, you know, in addition to having to deal with the pernicious anti-Semitism that was rampant at the time, where Edersheim was, once he got over that, he realized, you know, that the church was making all these mistakes. Rather than call out the pastors, you know, or start a new church or do any of these other typical things, he began to write. And he wrote a whole bunch of books. And one of them was called The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. And he writes this so that the Christians can understand how to interpret the New Testament by understanding what rules from the oral law were in force in Yeshua's day. And this is what Edersheim has to say. It is recorded, he writes, book 5, chapter 14, that they who brought him, meaning Yeshua, would not themselves enter the portals of the palace. Quote, that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Few expressions have given rise to more earnest controversy than this. On two things, at least we can speak with certainty. Entrance into a heathen house did Levitically render impure for that day. That is until the evening. The fact of such a defilement is clearly attested both in the New Testament and in the Mishnah. One of the other places where it's attested to in the New Testament, remember the centurion? Remember, he loves the nation, built a synagogue, but his servant was sick. Yeshua says, I'll go heal him. And then he says, Master, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof, but just say the word and he will be healed. Because he knew that if Yeshua went into his house, even though he was a believer, by rabbinic law, Yeshua would have been ritually defiled. So Yeshua said, you know what? I haven't found faith like this in all of Israel. And he healed him from a distance like that. So let's see. Entrance into a heathen house did Levitically render impure for that day. That is, till the evening. The fact of such a defilement is through the New Testament and in the Mishnah, though the reasons might be various. A person who had so become Levitically unclean was called Tebul Yom, bathed or flooded of the day. In other words, flooded with defilement. Okay? The other point is, Edersheim continues, that to have someone become impure for that day would not have disqualified for eating the Paschal lamb. And by that he means the one on the 14th. Now why would they be able to eat the 14th Paschal lamb? Because they roasted it throughout the night. So, in other words, when they begin to roast the lamb, the people who are impure, they can wash. Sunset happens. They can enter the camp again, and when they enter the camp again, that lamb is roasting. They can eat it. So that's Edersheim's point. He says they would not have been disqualified for eating that 14th Abib lamb, since the meal was partaken after the evening when a new day had begun. In fact, it is distinctly laid down that the bathed of the day, that is, he who had been impure for the day and had bathed in the evening, most certainly did partake of the Paschal supper. And an instance is related when some soldiers who had guarded the gates of Jerusalem immersed and ate the Paschal lamb. It follows that those Sanhedrists could not have abstained from entering the palace of Pilate, because by doing so they would have been disqualified for the Paschal supper. In other words, this can't be happening on the day of the 14th. They would not have had that concern because they knew they could eat that 14th lamb once the 15th started. Instead, John 18:28 can only be applying to the 15th. So he continues. The point is of importance because many writers have interpreted the expression of the Passover as referring to the Paschal supper, and have argued that according to the fourth gospel, our Lord did not on the previous evening partake of the Paschal lamb, or else that in this respect the account of the fourth gospel does not accord with that of the synoptists. In other words, John is running a day behind. But Edersheim says, but as for the reason just stated, it is impossible to refer the expression Passover to the Paschal supper. We only have to inquire whether the term is not also applied to other offerings. And this is what we were talking about, right? That any lamb slain at the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a Passover lamb. I wasn't just making this up, guys. So he says, and here both the Old Testament and the Jewish writings show, as they show, that the term Pesach or Passover was applied not only to the Paschal lamb, but to all the Passover sacrifices, especially to what was called the Hagigah, from Hag. So it's a festive offering to bring the festive sacrifice usual at each of the three great feasts. According to the express rule, the Hagigah was brought on the first festive Paschal day. It was offered immediately after the morning service and eaten on that day, probably sometime before the evening, when, as we shall by and by see, another ceremony claimed public attention. We can therefore quite understand that not on the eve of the Passover, But on the first Paschal day, the Sanhedrin would avoid occurring a defilement which, lasting until evening, would not only have involved them in the inconvenience of Levitical defilement on the first festive day, but have actually prevented their offering on that day the Passover festive sacrifice, or Hagigah. For we have these two express rules, that a person could not in Levitical defilement offer the Hagigah, and that the Hagigah could not be offered for a person by someone else who took his place. And he lists the sources. These considerations and canons seem decisive as regards to the views above expressed. There would have been no reason to fear the defilement on the morning of the Paschal sacrifice, but entrance into the praetorium on the morning of the first Passover day, i.e. the 15th, would have rendered it impossible for them to offer that Hagigah, which is also designated by the term Pesach. So he concludes, well, I conclude here, that's why Yeshua died on the afternoon of the 15th. Okay? And there's a lot more information. And of course, people have asked, why would that be on a high Shabbat? And I actually answered that question several times, including for part of Vayikra Sav. So you want to look at those notes. I get into a little bit more detailed discussion on that point. And there's also the Yeshua PowerPoint. When did Yeshua die? For you to look at for a detailed answer there. But now we're going to move on. And what I would like to do is to go through the history of Passover, or Pesach. And some of these associations may surprise you because there's Pesach before Pesach. Let me explain. As the first hint of Pesach that we get, this may surprise you, is actually Noah's flood. Now, what am I talking about? Let me explain. Noah's Ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. And I've done an exhaustive study, and you guys know, and I can't get into all of these details here because it took me 2 hours just to explain this. So let me give you the headline. Basically, what my chronology does is, in a nutshell, we get a fixed date for Exodus, right? And from that fixed date, following the Hebrew accounts of the patriarchs and their times and stuff, we count forwards and backwards from that fixed date, okay? When you do that, the year that you get for Adam's creation is 3901 BCE, which is 140 years before the rabbinic year zero, okay? I agree with the rabbis that the Hebrew timing of when the patriarchs had their sons is correct over the Septuagint, for example. But I also think they picked the wrong year zero to count those years from. Because of problems, their chronology, they admit, could be 163 years off. And that's a whole other discussion. We're not getting into it. So suffice to say, if I can figure out the exact day of the Exodus, I can figure out the exact day of Adam's creation, I can therefore go 1656 years from that creation to get to Noah's flood. And that means that the flood has a certain year. In my system, this is 2245 BCE is when the flood starts. I think it's November 7th, something like that. 2245 BCE, which means that the flood will go also, because it lasts a year, will go into 2244 BC. Okay. Well, what I'm able to do is I figured out the calendar that Noah used to count, and I can also take that and put those dates that Noah used into the Hebrew calendar. And when I did that, I just counted the days from the flood to when the ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. I came up with a Gregorian date of April 6th, 2244 BCE. I was curious, what is that in Hebrew terms? And it turned out that it was the 14th of Abib. So Noah's ark resting on the mountains of Ararat is actually, let's say that that ark rested on late in the afternoon, and then the sun sets. It's Passover. That's a very long story. I've got a link to one of my YouTube videos that will explain that in greater detail. Moving on, the next Passover is still before Passover. It's when Lot serves his guests matzah, which those guests are pretty good. I mean, it's Father Yah and two angels in Genesis 19, verse 1 through 3, and that would have been in the year 1852 BCE, right? And then finally, we have the historical Exodus that is in the year 1447 BCE. That's when they get out of Egypt. After that, 2 years later, the second Passover is instituted, so that if they're defiled, they can celebrate in the full moon of the following month. And that is in 1445 BCE. Then, in 38 years later, they add the requirement, Moshe adds the requirement that once Jerusalem is chosen, that's the only proper place to do it. He said, and that's in Deuteronomy 16, verse 5 through 6. Moshe adds that requirement in 1407 BCE. He'll be dead in a couple of weeks from when he says this. Or actually, he'll be dead on that day. I keep forgetting Deuteronomy's one day. Then, 2 years later, Joshua, Moshe's successor, keeps Passover in a place called Gilgal just before the Jericho battle. That's in 5 verse 10 through 12 of Joshua. That's 1405 BCE. And then after Joshua dies, he says that, as long as Joshua was alive, and it also has this little thing, as long as Joshua and his servants were alive. So it might have continued a little bit further on. But I'm just going to put this at Joshua's death. As long as Joshua was alive, that Israel served Yahweh with all their heart. That's what we're told. So when Joshua dies in 1356 BCE, that's when Passover, I will say, begins to get forgotten. Right? So they just slip up. But here's a surprise, because the next Passover that I've tracked actually happened under King Saul. People go, wait a second. King Saul didn't keep a Passover. It's not recorded that he kept a Passover. It actually is. Let me show you. You see, it doesn't say that directly that he did, but the text tells us Pesach was not kept, quote, since the days of Samuel the prophet. Right? 2 Chronicles 23:18, compare that with 2 Kings 23 verse 22, and 2 Chronicles 35 verse 18. So you do a little work and you try to, okay, this has not been done since the days of Samuel the prophet. Well, which part of Samuel's career are we talking about? We know they did not keep Pesach when Samuel was helping throughout the last years of the judges period. Okay? The only time then that the Pesach could have been kept was during the 18 years that Samuel was helping King Saul. And that would be from 1051 to 1033 BCE. Somewhere in there was at least one Pesach by direct reference in the scripture, but we know nothing else about it. So Saul does keep at least one Passover, Pesach. Next guy is obviously going to be King David. He begins to set up the infrastructure to bring Israel into official Torah observance, which is going to include Pesach, although I grant you it's not directly singled out. But he is getting the priests ready, he's getting the temple ready, he can't build it, but he's getting the materials together, he's building the logistics, the administration, dividing up the Levites into 24 divisions and the priests into 24 divisions and so on. So this sort of preparatory timing is from 974 to 971 BCE. Then 11 years later, King Solomon finished the temple, and he made Pesach observance mandatory, along with the other great feasts. So we know that Solomon's, has just commanded that Passover be kept, and that is in 960 BCE. Then, in spite of David and Solomon's efforts, Pesach observance at some point wanes again until the time of King Hezekiah 2 centuries later. Hezekiah ascended to the throne of Judah at the age of 25, according to 2 Chronicles 29, verse 1. The temple at this time was filthy and in shambles. Okay? Hezekiah's father Ahaz was evil and defiled it and its objects, according to 2 Chronicles 28, 24, 25. That's Hezekiah's father Ahaz. Nasty guy. Hezekiah was disgusted at this and wanted to get Israel back to righteousness at once, but there was a problem. The time for Pesach had just passed when he took the throne. And even if it hadn't, there weren't enough time to get the priests all clean and ready. They didn't have enough priests on hand to help slay those lambs. Okay? So he decided to follow the rules in Numbers 9 and do the Pesach in the next month, in Iyar, or Ziv. And so that national Pesach done in the second month happened in 715 BCE. Then a dark age, a little mini dark age hits Israel. This evil guy Manasseh reigns 55 years. Then his son is just as bad, but mercifully Ammon only reigns 2 years. And then a little kid named Josiah comes to the throne. But it's going to take 18 years for Josiah, with the help of his advisors, I have no doubt, to consolidate power and to learn when to make their move. And so Josiah wants to do the one thing Hezekiah couldn't do. Hezekiah kept Passover, as I said, but he kept it in the second month. Josiah's like, we're going to keep it in when it's supposed to be. That was a consolation prize. Now we're going for the grand prize. And so he does what we call the Great Pesach. Perfectly celebrated, amazingly well done in 622 BCE. And that is the highlight of the kingdom of Judah right there. But what's kind of unnerving is that what Josiah didn't know, or he would very shortly know, but he didn't know at this moment, was that the die had been cast and Father Yah had already decided he's wiping the kingdom of Judah out. They're going into Babylon because Manasseh was that evil. So after the temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av, which translates to July 11th in our calendar, 586 BCE, the prophet Ezekiel predicts that Pesach will return to Judah. And this prophecy of Ezekiel, like many of his prophecies, we can convert into our current calendar, dated to April 28th, 573 BCE. Pesach then returns with the dedication and opening of the second temple, right? On Friday, the 3rd of Adar, or March 11th in our current calendar, and that's according to Ezra 6, verse 15 through 22. And then the actual feast is kept April 15th through 22nd in that year. Once restored, Pesach observance will never leave the Jewish people living in Judah again. And it will follow them throughout their own diaspora and eventual return to the land. The date of the dedication of the temple, restored Pesach service after the Babylonian captivity, be 516 BCE. Okay? 70 years after they went in. I just need to do a very, very quick notation. And, okay. After that point, our story of the Pesach timeline shifts to Egypt. I mean, this is really ironic that the whole point was to get out of Egypt, and now guess where they've got a temple to Yahweh and a thriving Jewish community? Egypt. They actually had to modify their primitive Haggadah. They modified the prayers because the prayers were saying, blessed are Yahweh who got us out of Egypt, and they're in Egypt. And that's a very interesting thing that they do there. We know that this was done because of something called the Elephantine Papyri. Okay? And there was a temple built to Father Yah on the island of Elephantine. And that in itself is a very interesting story. You see, what had happened was Egypt was being ruled at this time by, I think, it's the 22nd dynasty, if I'm remembering. These dudes from Libya, okay? And then there was a native Egyptian uprising, and they booted these guys out, sent them packing. And then a new guy named Samtek, I think that's his name, Psammetichus or something, Psamtek the First, he takes the throne. The problem is he is not convinced that his enemies aren't likely to return. He needs to make provisions on his southern border. He hears about these Jews, okay, who have been having a horrible time in their country because Manasseh has defiled their temple. The priests are on the run. And he thinks to himself, you know, if they can't worship freely in their own land, maybe we can help each other. So he asks for, tens of thousands, like 30,000 or more soldiers and their families to move to Elephantine. Their job is to guard the southern border to keep the enemies from coming back up. They build a fort there, it gets provisions, it gets weapons, but it also gets a temple and an altar. And this decision to bring the ark, to build the temple, may have resulted in them bringing the ark into Egypt to protect it. And it might also explain King Josiah's behavior on the day that he died, and that's a whole other story. But in any case, this is there is a thriving Jewish community that is in Egypt that has a temple. Jeremiah may have seen that temple, and when he went after the one in Judah was destroyed. Okay? So, in any case, you fast forward about another century and a half, and now it's 419 BC, and there are instructions on the Elephantine papyri by these Jews in this temple in Egypt dedicated to Father Yah on how to do Passover. These are the oldest instructions on how to do a Seder that are outside of the Torah. You know, last year I met somebody who was convinced that the Seder was a completely modern, fictional, rabbinic fantasy. And I had to say, no, my friend. Not only is the Seder very closely modeled on the actual events in Exodus chapter 12, but you actually have these Elephantine papyri that are telling the Jews 5th century BCE how to do Passover, right? Then the next time, what's interesting is this temple that is on Elephantine Island will later be destroyed by pagans. What happened was there was an existing temple to this creator deity Khnum that was right near where the temple for Father Yah was. And these two groups of worshipers didn't like each other because Khnum was supposed to be, in some versions, the creator. Okay? So here you've got two deities that are vying for creator status. Of course, we know the right one, Father Yah. And when the politics had changed and the southern border was pacified and new king was in charge, the pagans ripped up the temple for Father Yah. And so time passes, and then a new temple is built to Father Yah in Egypt, but this time according to a prophecy in Isaiah 19 that it be in the city of the sun, okay, or Heliopolis. And it gets its own priesthood and everything in 170 BCE. They're again doing Passover in Egypt. From there, the rules on the feasts, including Pesach, they go into wider Jewish literature that is outside of the scripture, the Book of Jubilees, and some other types of extra-biblical literature. That's around 160 BCE. Then another group of people flee into the desert. They have their own way of doing Passover. They're called the Essenes. They write a little thing you might have heard of, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls have instructions on how to do Passover. That's about 150 BCE. After that, references to Moshe and Passover, Pesach, becomes so popular that even the pagans are aware of it, and they're writing about what they see, including a dude named Diodorus and another guy named Strabo. And their accounts are somewhere from 45 BC to 1780. Okay? The next great time in Passover, Yeshua the Messiah keeps Passover, Pesach, at age 12. That would be 8 CE or AD. And then, of course, he dies during the Feast of Unleavened Bread in 30 CE. And then, as testimony about Yeshua spreads, the Apostle Paul teaches Pesach to the Corinthians. Yes, he does. And that would be about the year 56 CE. Pesach observance will then continue amongst both Jewish and Gentile Messianic believers from the 1st century to when Constantine puts the kibosh on it in 325. And also the final version of the Pesach Seder is written around 170 AD, so mid-2nd century. Pesach for Gentiles is forbidden by Constantine in 325. And the last major development in Pesach has to do with a guy that you might not be thinking about. Real unexpected hero. I could tell you about one of my favorite Protestants. His name is William Tyndale. Now, Tyndale is one of those guys I'd really like to go out and have a beer with. Okay? Because the way that we see things, not necessarily theologically, but linguistically, forget about it. Tyndale was the person who invented the word Passover. It's true. He didn't like, he didn't want to say Pesach or Pascha. He certainly didn't want to do Easter, which is what the King James did in Acts 12:4. And he said, you know what? Father Yah sent the angel of death to pass over the houses, so it's Passover. And the most ironic, wonderful thing happened. The rabbis agreed. The rabbis decided to start calling it Passover after William Tyndale. I can't remember another time that rabbis made a universal agreement so quickly, so decisively, which still continues for so long, based on the word of a single Protestant, Tyndale. And Tyndale's my hero for other reasons. If you want to have some fun, pull up Tyndale's New Testament, like in BibleWorks, and type the word church, and see how often it appears. Here's a hint. He will say assembly or congregation. So, that's in 1525 CE. So, to conclude on this part of the Pesach special, without Passover, there's no Judaism, there's no Christianity, or at the very least the core of each of these faiths would have been irrevocably altered without Pesach. For Jews, Passover is their constitution that speaks their nation into existence, but it's also their declaration of independence from Egypt too. For Christians, Passover is the true beginning of their faith, which without belief in the resurrection of Yeshua, which happened at that time, their faith is useless. 1 Corinthians 15:17. And even if some might argue that, and perhaps suggest that Shavuot, Pentecost, is the birthday of the church, oh, I hear that all the time, the fact remains you can't get to Shavuot without going through Passover. Okay? So, I'm sorry, church, that's not your birthday. Your birthday is in Pesach. And for those of us who broadly count themselves Hebrew roots, Messianic Jews, Nazarenes, whatever you want to call yourself, naturally we have to kind of pick up the best of both worlds, from Judaism and Christianity. We have to then fuse it with our own insights and our own halakha that is more consistent. And as for the rest, it's kind of like the Paschal Lamb at daybreak. Destroy the rest of it on the fire, as I see it, both Moshe and Yeshua have become essential to the majesty of Pesach. Yeshua said it best in two places. Actually, three places, I think. Yeah, three places. Luke 24:44-46 we read, "And he said to them, These are the words that I spoke to you while I was with you, that it was necessary that all things that were written in the Torah of Moshe and the prophets and in the Psalms concerning me be fulfilled." Then he opened up their mind to understand the scriptures, and he said to them that thus it was written, and thus it was right, that the Mashiach suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. It was written. Yochanan 1:45 we read, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "He concerning whom Moshe wrote in the Torah and the prophets, we have found him. He is that Yeshua, the son of Joseph of Nazareth." And my personal favorite. "For if only you had believed in Moshe, you would also be believers in me, because Moshe wrote concerning me. And if you do not believe the writings of that man, how will you believe my words?" And so this is where we'll leave part 1. Part 2 will begin with a special bonus teaching with a surprising title, but please bear with me. This is not what it sounds like, okay? I'm not going all churchy on you, okay? But I do stand by the title, which is How the Christians Are Right and the Rabbis Are Wrong About This Year, 2016. The church is right about something and the rabbis are wrong. And I'm going to tell you what it is, because it relates directly to what we do as believers. That's in part 2. I'll talk to you soon. Shalom.